Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Sales Chatter, the podcast where we aim to help 10,000 sales reps generate $1 million GP in under 12 months. Today, we got a great crew with us. The same crew, actually, that answered all those awesome questions on Friday. I don't know if you were on Fun Day Friday, but Dean especially loved all of those questions. He was like, he texted me all weekend saying he couldn't stop thinking about the questions and how awesome they were. And, so today we have Data Day, my friends. Data Day Wednesday, one of the best days of the week. And we're going to bring the Q&A man himself in, Dean. Dean, I know you're still raving about those questions. Hey, buddy, I know. They were pretty good.
I'm surprised you'd have me back. It was such an awful performance.
It was actually a great performance. Speaking of great performers, we got Jeff Dickinson, the Bodacious Cowboy, with us here today. You like that?
I'm really surprised that Dean came today. I really after Friday.
Guys, you're sounding like I was a bad host here or something. Like I'm Jim Carrey when he first started on whatever, I forget where he was now.
Oh my God!
Not the Wheel of Fortune. What's the one with the letters? Anyways, whatever.
Oh my God!
You see my descriptions? They're pretty vivid, eh?
Yeah.
So, gents, what's happening? Long weekend? Did you guys take Monday off as well? What was happening, Diener?
Yeah, we all closed down. I mean, I worked every day because I just had, I just do stuff every day so that I stay on top of it. But it was a 4-day break for most of us at DAT. I think a lot of carriers probably had some time off. I just following guys on Instagram. They were, anecdotally, a small data set. But when you look at social media enough, you start to see the patterns. And drivers were certainly heading home for the weekend to have some time off. The majority were, which long haul guys that I follow in particular, which was a good sign. So this will be a quiet week.
Conversation with a buddy and that does. He's a driver. This weekend, and I said, "Oh, you're out for long weekend?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "My company is actually paying me time and a half on miles." And I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "It's the first company I've ever known that's done that." He says, "But so he's out in BC, so he took an Atlantic Canada run." And when I spoke to him on Monday afternoon, he was sitting in New Brunswick having a seafood platter. So listen, dude, if I can get a seafood platter and make time and a half, miles and a half, he goes, I'm in all day long. And I was
yesterday, just like Dean, definitely didn't have my finger off the pulse, but it was kind of slow. I was just answering some emails and, just that kind of stuff, but it really wasn't. A lot of companies were closed. And this whole week, Dan, and I'm sure that Dean will agree as well. There's a lot of traffic managers, supply chain managers, logistics managers that said, hey, here's a good benefit. I can get a whole week off by only taking 3 vacation days because I get paid for Monday and Tuesday. So it still doesn't say that you have to take your foot off the gas. I mean, there's still opportunities out there. So
but you know what? It's like if you look at Canadian traffic managers, U.S. traffic managers, if you deal with Canada, Monday was a holiday. If you deal with the U.S., Tuesday was a holiday. Right. So like everybody in logistics, North American logistics, this week is the week because it's slow as it is. There was a big push last week before. Well, maybe there was. We'll talk to Dean about that. But then, you take 4 days and you get 9 days vacation, right? Because you have obviously the holiday that you're given plus 2 weekends in there. So you get 5 days extra for, 4 days holiday. And not to mention the amount of undeliverables I got this morning already on my emails, I'm sorry, undeliverables, out of office on vacation is astronomical. Because it was like, and I mean, I shouldn't say astronomical because every year I think we forget. It's kind of like that first snowfall. People forget how to drive in the winter. But it's the beginning of the vacation season, right? It's the beginning of the season where people are going to get harder to get a hold of. Deals are going to be slower to close. Like we all know this. And with it comes the question of the week, Dean. How did the spot market and how did North American traffic manage up until the 4th?
Well, it's a great segue to this week's update because as I wrote in my blog post that's going out this week, the shipping volumes last week were uncharacteristically high, which I think supports the theory that we're working on here, and that is that this week a lot of people are taking time off because it's a 3-day week. Shipping volumes, so these are load post volumes in the spot market. Normally they'd go up about 11% in the week prior to July 4. Last week up 22% week over week. So there was a noticeable surge in shipping volumes last week, as we supposed or surmised on the show the prior week. Last week would have been a very busy week as shippers cleared their docks for end of half year, end of quarter, end of month to make a lot of their targets. So that looks like what's happened. No surprise then that the capacity tightened and rates went up slightly, but not by near this level you'd expect. But the volume of load posts in the dry van market are pretty much identical to 2019. If you wanted to find a year that was most representative of where we are today, 2019 was a pretty lackluster year for truckload carriers and all of us. So that's where they're sitting right now. Load to truck ratio is sitting at about 3.54 loads per truck, and that's slightly above where it was in 2019. So some pretty mediocre numbers, Dan, but there was more volume last week. The net impact on spot rates, I think, is probably the more important data point for all of us because it sort of portends to where I think the market will go for the rest of the year, which, to remind those that maybe missed some of the predictions, we were thinking that the rest of this year was going to be pretty flat if we didn't see a spike in volumes around July 4. So produce season, which peaked over the weekend, if you look at USDA volumes going back the last 30 years, you will see once they get past the week ending 6/29, they literally fall off a cliff. Shipping volumes, the produce just plummet. So what I do is I look at the change in spot rates from the Vidalia onion pack date in mid-April to July 4, and the change in spot rates in dry van is typically 18 cents a mile over that period of time. This year it was 9, only went up 9 cents a mile. At least it went up, only went up 9 cents a mile. And in the refrigerated category, volumes were pretty good. They actually had a pretty strong finish to the first half of the year after us thinking, they were off to a very late start driven by the wet weather in California. Volumes have been down, if you remember, in that 12 to 15% year over year range for most of April and May. They came back to being looking like about identical to this time last year. So produce volumes made a little bit of a recovery, which again is not unexpected. The big difference though is that spot rates normally go up 24 cents a mile between mid-April and July 4. This year, just 14. So roughly half of what you'd normally expect to see the lift in rates. And I think
what did it do in 2019?
Spot rates in 2019 were about 9 cents a mile lower than where we are now.
But what was the lift based on the Vidalia onion so if you could, because obviously we're talking about kind of most of the comparisons we're doing these days is towards 2019, right? So do you have any of that data to see? Because it was 2019, was a very stressful year for a lot of people.
Yeah, let me quickly pull that up, Dan.
Very true.
Yeah, we've got, so I think this is Stacy, because Stacy's been telling me she's having a hard time with, for some reason, it just says LinkedIn user. We were slow. Everyone was prepared last week to get urgent freight out to hit month end. My customers worked from home Monday. We were off yesterday. I do see an influx of requests to recover loads that weren't picked up yesterday. Yes, that's actually a very good thing. Yeah. And Scott says we were slow but available.
Yes, definitely.
So Dan, to answer your question, in 2019, spot rates in dry van went up 12, only up 9 this year. So they went up more in 2019.
Okay.
But don't forget, we've got a lot more trucks in the market this year.
Than we did in 2019? Oh, yes, obviously.
Yeah, right. Yes. And in refrigerated, they went up 15 cents a mile. And this year, they're up 14. So in the reefer market, not dissimilar to the lift in spot rates in 2019. So, for those that are,
it's actually Shay. Sorry, Dean. I think my settings are blocked. It's Shay. Hey, Shay, how are you?
Hey, Shay.
Okay, so we're up 9 cents, not 12, but there is more truck. Okay, all right.
So not a horrible year, but it's actually panning out pretty much as what we thought it would. We didn't, I think we were all hoping for a spike in spot rates driven by produce volumes, but given, just the way consumers are thinking about the market, right? So July is the quietest month in my wife's catering business, right? So you get through the June peak of, commencements, graduations, fundraising, and then you get to July. After July 4, it's summer vacation time, and the market just cools right off. So that's why you see a drop in volume. We were always thinking that if we got to July 4 and rates were going up like they would normally be, we'd be in pretty good shape for the rest of the year. The fact they were kind of decelerating into July 4 was not a good sign. No. The fact they're not as bad as they were in both 2019 and last year is a good sign. So I think our forecast that rates are going to be pretty much flat as in where they are now for most of the year. I just don't see any major demand event doing anything with the market, because if you think about seasonality, what are the big things that lift the market that are big seasonal needle moving events? Produce season's one of them. Back to school, holiday shipping season is another. So, there's just not a lot of signs that the market will be, any better because of an increase in demand. We're looking at roughly the same level of imports as 2019 in May. Jason Miller had a good post out this week. He was talking about a regression to the mean. But what I think he's saying is that that's just for May. By the end of the year, we could be 7 to 10% lower than 2019 volumes. Even though we're level with them now, we could see lower volumes throughout the year end. So that's where we're looking at. I think we're looking at a fairly flat year from a demand perspective. We're still seeing carriers leave the industry as we track the movement of interstate carriers. They are leaving at a decreasing rate, if that makes any sense to anybody in the world of statistics. What it means is there's fewer carriers leaving the industry in June than there were in May, but it's not enough to move the needle because diesel prices dropped to $3.77 last week. So diesel prices dropped another 3.5 cents. They're down $2.04 since the July or the June peak of last year. And what's actually happened, Dan and Jeff, this is quite bizarre. In May, according to my model for the long haul carrier, in May, carriers were making just 3 cents a mile gross profit. But last year it was more like $1, right? So they're making this year in May, April, May, 3 and 4 cents, June, 9 cents. So they're actually making more money as diesel drops and rates start to bottom out and come back up. Why do we care about that? It means that capacity will bleed off at a much slower rate. There won't be this massive exodus of carriers that some think there will be, because as we've said here on the show, carriers are hanging in there. It's not great times, but they are hanging in there. And as I've said, some of them are still a breakdown away from going out of business. Absolutely. Because at 9 cents a mile gross profit on 100,000 miles, that's 9,000 a year. You kind of get in the workshop and get the hood tilted for an in-frame rebuild, but that's about it.
Right? Yeah. Forget about engine blowing.
They're not lifting a spanner until you've got another half of that in the bank in escrow ready to pay. So that's where I think a lot of carriers are at. They're just hoping, that things don't break. It's one of your biggest fears when you drive a truck long distance is that you're constantly listening for noises and smells. You are.
You're definitely focused in on that.
Yeah, like you smell oil dropping on the manifold. Like that's a distinct smell. Turbos going, like they make a distinct sound. Water temperature, all those sorts of things in summer give you all sorts of anxiety as a truck driver, especially when the margins aren't there. So these are tough times for carriers. tough times for everybody, I think, in the industry, because we're all going through a lot of different challenges and changes, but we've still got a very healthy market.
A conversation this morning with a customer, because so there's a big boom in housing in Ontario.
Right.
And over the last couple of weeks, some of my customers that are in construction are like, I want 5, 6, 7, 10 trucks a day. And this week, a customer called us and said, okay, we're looking at 4. And I said, really? Last week we were doing 7. I said, if you don't mind me asking, like, what's happening? And she said, well, pretty much almost half my warehouse is taking vacation this week.
Yeah.
So it's not just traffic managers. And I said half. She goes, yeah. She goes, since COVID, it's tough to get good employees. Right. She goes, we used to have a policy where only 10% of our warehouse could be off. And if you submitted your request after, she goes, we had to get rid of that policy because people were like, you're not going to tell me when I'm going to take vacation. So now my customer needs 700,000 pieces every week to fulfill orders, which is about 10 truckloads a day. And that's not happening. We got 4. And so it's actually because the shippers, dock workers are saying, no, we're on vacation. We're taking this week off. And then obviously, I don't know if you guys have the construction holiday at the end of the month. So the last week of July is construction holiday in Ontario. So pretty much every construction company takes it off. Anything to do with excavating, gravel, house building, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a major push in my area to get so much product in before the holiday. And I found it very interesting because it's no longer a matter of production can't keep up, because a lot of the production's digitized, it's computerized, and it's robotic. Now it's a fact that labor to load, and even my customer in Ontario is like, he's short 4 forklift drivers this week to load trucks. So all these volumes are being adjusted because of people's vacation schedule, because and this is just obviously one tiny segment of the North American market, but it'd be interesting to see how many companies' volumes are down specifically because they don't have the manpower to keep up with it because of vacation. Like, forget traffic managers, forget selling for a moment, forget all of that. It's like, and it brought me to a new question leading into the holidays. What's your team's, what's your warehouse's vacation schedule coming up? Because remember, we were talking 2 weeks ago, I think we were saying leading into the holiday, like what days do you close, customs problems, all these kinds of things. And never once did I think to ask, what's going on with your staff? Right. Your team members to produce bills of ladings. Like she was telling me, it's not just the people loading trucks. She goes, I've got half the office in here. So if we were to pump out 10 trucks a day, half the office would not be able to complete the paperwork, which means drivers might be, by the time they get to the border, but depending, if it's 4 o'clock and you're finished loading, you're not getting the paperwork till the next morning. It means you're sitting at the border because it's just too much volume for these people to handle. Do you guys see any of that in your businesses, or like, is there, because it was kind of a new little thing that popped up for me today, just this morning, an hour before we got on. And I was like, well, that's very interesting. That's something new that I've never asked before to any of my shippers is, your staff, your team, your back office is, like, what is their vacation schedule, right?
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, Dan, coming from that side of the industry, this isn't new. This is old stuff that happens all the time. What happens operationally is that they fail to do the handoff. They fail to create a schedule for their manpower, where we used to steal from Peter to pay Paul because we knew the inbound that was coming in, the outbound was coming in, always slow in this area. So we would steal the head count from A to give it to B to take over that overlap. And we based it on seniority as well. When you have 50 guys working in the warehouse, everybody wants to take off the week of July, right? Because like I said before, they gain those extra days and they gain 9 days or 10 days of vacation time. So it's that handoff. And that's a critical question to ask all your shippers. hey, what does your schedule look like? We're on course, like you said, for 10 a day. Are we going to be able to maintain that, or do we have to cut it back? And to what? Have you thought of this? Have you looked at your operations? Have you thought about taking from Peter to pay Paul? Those are the kind of questions you have to ask.
Well, and you know what? It brings up another point. And Dean, maybe next week we can, if you have some way of finding this, it'd be interesting to see how many extra hours drivers sit on dock. Because again, we're down from 7 to 4. And I immediately called my team and said, like, listen, this is what's happening. So just monitor carefully, because we were typically 35, 40 minutes on the dock. Monitor carefully how long we're on the dock, because it'd be, I mean, and I can give you the data that we get back, but it'd be interesting to see how many additional hours are spent on dock, because there's just not enough staff. And like you said, Jeff, if you're not stealing from Peter to pay Paul, something has got to give. And normally it's let the driver wait, unfortunately. But
right, and
interesting. Do you have a data point on that, Dean, at all, like waiting time or anything like that?
Sorry, you want to finish your thought, Jeff?
Yeah, that's the SG&A cost, where service providers like yourself can help guide them and saying, okay, you were only on the dock for half an hour. Now it's to 2 hours. We've got 10 loads a day times an hour and a half of wait time per each times 5 days a week. Here's the extra expense that you're paying in order to do the same thing you did last week with less people. How can we build it together that will reduce your cost, limit the amount of outbound, limit the amount of inbound, and be able to catch up?
And I think just as importantly, Jeff, is communicate with your carrier what the flow is going to be, because what you'd want to be knowing is that it's gone from 10 to 4, but we can spot some trailers and preload some trailers for you, so you don't tie up the truck.
Shippers are doing that, guys?
I think carriers are. I think carriers that have got excess equipment would absolutely want to do that, Dan.
No. What I'm saying is relaying that information.
Oh, probably. Good question.
And I'll give you a perfect valid point. Been working with this customer for a long time, but I don't think if I called, I would know. And the reason I say that is not because it's a, wake up this morning and how am I going to screw Dan over? I think it's just a wake up this morning and how am I going to make all the points meet in my company to make sure things run smooth. And I just, and again, I'm asking this question. I because after almost 30 years in the business, this just came to light today. Like I've never thought to ask this before. And I've never been called ever by a customer and said, hey, FYI, I've got half staff. It's only when drivers have been sitting there for 3-4 hours and I make the phone call and say, hey, what's going on? Oh, I'm half staff today. Like, and so, and maybe Jeff, that's a question more for you than Dean, because you're more in that side with me. Do you find these phone calls come out to you when you were a shipper?
Yes.
Did you make those phone calls or want to make them but get carried away, or was it like, and maybe I don't mean to put it like this, but maybe you're the wrong person to ask, because I know you're very driver centric. But I'm just wondering how many shippers, and maybe some of the audience can share with us, how many shippers are actually pre-thinking this when it comes to their drivers as opposed to their employees and their internal KPIs.
Yeah, those things that, Dan, is highly critical. That you talk about collaboration and building long-term business relationships with your service providers and carriers. If you're a shipper, and that's a key point right there, communication and letting the drivers and your service providers know when you're closed down, when you're working a half day, the schedule, all of that kind of stuff, because it's all related to the bottom line, which is cost of doing business. What is that going to relate to? How is that going to affect your carriers, right? And your service providers? If they don't know, they won't ask. So that's why you have to prepare yourself and ask in advance. If you know a holiday is coming up, hey, what's your work schedule? How's it looking? Are we still going to maintain the number of truckloads that we've been doing over the last several weeks? Will we need to reduce? What do I need to tell the carrier? And the carrier too, because you know what? Carrier has drivers that want to go on vacation as well. So, you've got to, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You've got to be both ways and communicate. It's key to a very efficient operation to cut costs.
But I guess, sorry, Dean, go on, Dean.
I think the communication between, say, a network planner and a large truckload carrier and their shipper is probably pretty tight. I think there's a lot of those discussions that Jeff talked about that goes on where you've got some big carriers that you have to plan with. But I think as you go down the tree and you get the smaller carriers and the smaller shippers, especially shippers that have got multiple carriers, I suspect that conversation doesn't happen all that often. So I think it's a function of scale. But the reason I started that, Dan, is that I don't think that question gets asked, because that's one of the first questions you'd want to be asking if you're a carrier is, what is the plan for this summer? To be honest, I'd never thought about it, but it's exactly what happens. Because if my wife's catering business has very low number of events in June, well, where are people? Well, they're on vacation and they're not working. So it stands to reason that those people that are not working are on vacation, cruise ships, at the beach, partying, all those wonderful things that we do in summer. They're not working. They're not working in places that we would normally expect them to work. In the summer. And
Jeff brought up a good point, because you have your inbound. If you're a manufacturing facility, you have your raw product inbound, you have your finished goods outbound, you have your team inside the facility, and as much as it, I think as much as we always consider it a two-way street, as a logistics provider, I think we're the ones that have to initiate the conversation. I really do, because again, as much as you would hope that, or let's say not hope, my customers are really good friends of mine, and they care about the communication. They care about additional costs. And let's face it, from after COVID, shippers really understand how fast logistics can chew into their profits, right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts. If they lived through any of the last 4 years in logistics, they understand how costs can completely get out of whack if you allow it to. But we had the conversation this morning, and he was like, "You know what, Dan, I meant to call you, but I got tied up because I have these many people off, and he's got drivers coming into his window, and his employees coming in saying, we're short on this, we're short on that." He goes, "Sorry, man, I just never even thought to tell you we have to reduce our deliveries this week by half." So now I've got all these loads that picked up on Friday, and then Monday was a holiday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in Canada, I'm getting half delivered. So now I've got trucks sitting in people's yards, and they're saying, well, and you see the cyclical nature of revolution, right? Now they can't get back down south because I'm utilizing a trailer. And so it's like, it creates this consistent, and the conversation I had this morning was, did all of these people just not show up yesterday? And he said, no, they've all booked it. And he goes, but and then this is the thing, right? He goes, it didn't connect because there's so much going on the week before. Quarter end, month end, and so he says there was so much going on. I never thought to look. And he goes, and now they're playing catch up. And this is a massive company, like massive. And there's I don't know, and maybe I love your guys' stuff. There's so much pressure on traffic managers now to keep that cost minimal, to make sure things are running correctly, to make sure drivers are getting in and out so there's no detention time, and there's all this, that I think that the view forward is getting shorter and shorter, if you know what I mean. Like, not that no one looks forward, but I think the view forward, and it's exactly what my customer told me this morning. He goes, I completely dropped the ball, and he goes, and I can't, because I'll never do it again, because I can't believe I did it, because now all week it's right, like it's like not planning for success in a week when everything, and so he's going, thank the Lord they're only shipping 4 instead of 10, but what's going to happen a week from now? The boss is going to say, we're not hitting the inbound numbers with the number of units that we need. Right. So it's like this, and he knows that. He's already like, I already know I'm going to get an email next week on Tuesday when the numbers weren't hit this week. So it's like, I don't know. What do you guys, and I don't know where I'm even going with this. It's just more.
Oh, no, it's good. It's good. It's good, Dan, because here's the question, right? And I always say, and Dean loves this too, let the data speak for itself. What did it cost you as a shipper for not notifying me? Secondly, I would say to him, okay, since we're down 6 loads per day, what's your ramp up schedule so that I can work with my carriers in order to meet your needs? What does next week look like? Does it mean that we're doing 16 a day to catch up for last week? Or are we going to do the trickle down effect where we might do 13, 13, 13? The following week we'll go to 13, 13, 13, and then we'll be back to 10 a day. How does that look so that I can relay that information to my carriers so we can ramp up, get the drop trailers in there, make sure that we've got that. Boom. End of discussion.
That's a critical discussion.
Yeah,
it's a critical discussion.
Scott says, I feel as a broker, you should know that that's a good point to think about. I've never been told in advance that this facility would be short-staffed. Definitely adding to holiday SOP.
Absolutely.
So, right then, experienced people not, and again, this is the first year I've experienced it. Because I think companies now, like Jeff said, you talked about seniority, right?
Yes.
So, as hard as it is to get good people into work, to keep them there and to keep them there every day. If they were that one month off of this seniority and that person wanted this week off, right? The amount of people that need workers are like, all right, I quit. I'll get a job tomorrow at the place down there with my week off. And it's like, so, you want to keep them. And that's what in the US, not Canada, because they didn't have that. In the US, that's what I was told by my customers that, Dan, we've been struggling for good people. And she goes, I can't say no because they'll just quit. They'll just up and leave. And she goes, and now I've got a long-term problem as opposed to a 4-day problem or a 3-day problem. Because it's really only 3 days. They were closed Monday, Tuesday for the 4th. So it's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it's a 3-day problem. She goes, I'd rather have a 3-day problem and kind of, not sleep for 3 days than try and rehire, retrain, and keep good people. And I said, I get that. I really do. My bad. I wish we would have talked about it earlier. Like Scott says, adding it to my holiday SOP. And that's good, Scott. I hope everybody watching does add that to their holiday SOP. Because I'll tell you one thing, brother, that was in big, bold letters on my holiday SOP. Now, unbelievable.
Yeah, but something too, to follow up on that, we're talking about seniority. And here's another thing to think about when you look at the scenario of seniorities leaving. When you let seniority people go, you're letting go experience as well. How is that going to affect their productivity? It won't be up as high because the senior guys know a lot more than the guys on the bottom level. So that production is going to come down. I don't care who you are, but being there and seeing that, we used to say, okay, you know what? You got this holiday. I know that everybody wanted to, but Bob, you're going to have the seniority on the next holiday because we had to switch that up because of the experience and in the departments in which they work. You have to take that into consideration. Again, another pertinent question as a service provider to ask your shippers, what does that look like on the productivity side? How is that going to? Because they may not have thought about that. There's your value add for them to go and say, that's a good point. Let me look into that.
It's interesting you bring that up. Over the weekend, I was sitting with a buddy of mine I haven't seen in a while, and he works in gravel pits, and he's been there for 33 years now, 30 years. And he says, because he started when he was 22. He said, Dan, he goes, I haven't worked a 9-hour shift in probably 7 years. And I go, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, why? He goes, it's funny. I get everything done so much faster. So we had this new guy say, I've been here 4 weeks and I haven't seen you work a full shift. And he goes, well, I do work a full shift. And he goes, no. And he says, okay, so let's do this. We'll both load 10 dump trucks. See how fast you are. And he goes, and I loaded 10 in time he loaded 3.
Yep.
Because he's been operating the machinery it's like an extension of his body, right? He goes, the way he put it, it was like a Ginsu knife. He just and it's so much faster and productive and safe at the same time. Yes. Right. Whereas it's like when you drive, right, when you're new, you're like, now we get in our cars and we're like, and there's all these things happening here. You don't even see it. And unless it comes within the next 2 feet of your peripheral in front of your vehicle, that's when you do it. So it's interesting you say that for shippers who have there's that balance as well, right? The mix of experience and seniority and appeasing everybody into a holiday schedule.
Right. You want that balance throughout the whole week. And another way of being able to control that is worksheets per man hour. So you take the guys that are the high producers and the people who are at the low producers, then you take that average. That average now tells you how much productivity that you'll be able to do on an hourly basis in a specific part of the logistics operation. And by knowing how that works and those mechanisms, you can help them drive that to think a little bit outside the box that they normally wouldn't do. And that's where they're going to save even more money because, like you said, they got that pressure, save money, put more money to the bottom line. And they fail to think of the other opportunities that are right there at their fingertips, and they just don't look at it. And as a service provider, you can just say, hey, have you thought about looking at that? How would that affect your operations? Do you do such a thing like that? Boom, a conversation opens up, and then you better have those answers to those questions because that's the next thing they're going to be asking. How do I do that? What's the benefit of it? How am I going to add to my efficiency and my productivity on a daily basis while all these people are on vacation? It's a good conversation to have.
Yeah, great conversation.
And the extension of all this is, if you go from 10 loads to 4 and those other 6 trucks are probably not back where they would normally be for that weekly turn. If you're a carrier, you're probably going to run them on different origin destination pairings to get the drivers' miles up, which means they're not there when the ramp up occurs. You've got to position those trucks back in the market for the ramp up. And then if you go 13, Jeff, suddenly the carrier's got to find another 3 trucks over his 10 trucks that he's got. I'm just talking theoretically, but you see what happens. And that carrier has then got to try to go to the spot market and buy three trucks at lower than the contract rate. Because I'm guessing the shipper is
that's all
part or even above the contract rate because you gotta find the trucks. You got and then now the shipper's paying more, or you know what I mean, that kind of thing. Like it causes a whole mess. Dean.
So my question would be though, if I'm a carrier and I want to keep that 10 loads a week, I'm probably going to try and get the load covered for the same rate that I always do it at.
Yes.
Because in this loose market, I can probably buy capacity at a lower rate. If it was a tight market and this happened, you're going to pay a lot more because you just won't be able to find the trucks. And then you've got a spot market scenario. So my question would be then to Jeff, like, would a shipper automatically assume that in a ramp-up situation where the ramp-up exceeds the carrier's capacity that they're going to pay more, that there's a spot market play?
Again, and I'm just looking at it my point of view, right? You're going to have your primary, your secondary, and tertiary carriers, right? Whatever the primary carriers can't handle, you're going to go to your secondary carriers for the backup. But again, like I've always said, you have to feed these carriers throughout the whole year because you don't want them coming back and saying, oh, you want me to fill a void, but what have you done for me lately? You don't want that conversation, right? Yeah. So you have to think that in the back of your mind. Okay, I'm feeding Bob. Bob's carriers, but I'm going to bring it down a little bit, and then I'm going to take care of Sam. I'm going to raise him up a little bit so we have a balanced playing field. So when this happens, I'll be able to cover them. But again, it's all about collaboration and communicating with your carriers and knowing when that ramp up is going to happen and give them enough advance notice so they can prepare. That's how you build those long-term business relationships. Failure to communicate is a failure to push a business forward and create value. So you have to think about this all the time. You really do.
If I'm a carrier, I'm the tertiary, I do not want the second guy in there at all. I'm going to do whatever I can to keep that load out. We always had when I ran the Case New Holland Farm Machinery contract in Australia, we did all of that logistics across the entire country. We'd probably move about 70 over-dimensional loads a week of anything from bulldozers to combines to backhoes. And we had a golden rule that whenever we would go to Case to pick up the number of loads for the day, we would say, no problems, we'll get it moved. irrespective of whether I had 0 trucks in the yard and 50 loads, the answer was always the same. We'll move it, not a problem. We've got the equipment. And of course, what you do is you run in and out of the yard, picking up all the machinery. You take it back to the yard to consolidate. So for all intents and purposes, the customer got the loads moved, but in the background, you provided a level of service that you were committed to, because the shipper they just want to know that you got the job done and it met their price standards, their service standards. There was no damage. But it was some scary times when you pull, 50 loads out over the course of 2 or 3 days, and then you've got, maybe half that in trucks. That takes some pretty creative logistics. It also takes some pretty strong partnerships with carriers that you can call off the bench.
Yes.
Because when you get into specialized. Yep.
I got a question for you. I think you would know this. What would it cost for non-communication to cover all those loads because you didn't know it? There's got to be a cost associated with that, because now you're scrambling to cover the loads because you have a contract, right?
Right.
You got to meet or exceed the customer's expectation. They just dropped the bomb on you. How much is it going to cost you outside the normal cost to cover those loads? And this is critical, guys, because this is what it's all about, communication. What does that cost for failed communication?
So in this particular business with farm machinery, we would have to typically end up paying 30% more for the carrier that we bring in, which is a sizable number. Now, we were making a lot of money up front because we knew this would happen. So we'd already factored in the 30% lift when we were pushed, because the customer was so bad at their planning part of their business. They would have tractors coming out of the shop. They tell you on Monday that they'll have 30, 35, 42, 80, dual wheel tractors ready, which are over-dimensional by about 6 inches either side. Come Friday, they've got 10 ready because they didn't have enough paint. But and you can't, because it was a unionized shop, we couldn't get inside, walk around and have a look at them. So you kind of you get slammed with it. But we knew over the course of times that was what was going to happen, and we factored it into our pricing. Just like if I'm I'm bumping docks for a shipper, and it takes me 40 minutes longer per load at a particular shipper, I'm loading that into my rate because I'm just going to assume all that crazy stuff's going to happen.
Well, it's also eating into your HOS too, right?
Well, it is, but I think that from a customer service point of view, our biggest problem was bringing in carriers that couldn't haul machinery, because what they'd end up doing is putting the chain across the wheel lugs. And you get to the dealer, next thing you got lugs on a big tractor shootout, like stupid things like that, because you're in the dark, you're loading, you're in a hurry, you're trying to get all these loads moved to be delivered next week, and you miss that one trailer that's where the driver has loaded it incorrectly. The chains are in the wrong spot, and they're going to wear. They haven't put rubber in between the chain and the machine. They're going to wear off new paint. All this sort of stuff goes on.
You got a 30% increase in cost. Then you've got to deal with
the
claim,
damage,
replacement, more shipping because you have to ship those wheels out, new rims, all this. So there's a huge cost for non-communication, a massive cost that they don't take into consideration.
But because you guys bring this up, when I was doing a lot of work for Bruce Power Plant for Northern Ontario, Schneider Electric was creating huge generators for them. And I was speaking to the guys at Schneider because each generator was about $6 million. And I said, okay, so what's your process? He said, well, first thing we do is we load it. And he says, and the drivers stand here with us when we load it. He says, and then for 45 minutes, my technicians go over how they strap it. Every driver, doesn't matter if he's been here 15 times, we will always go over, because it's when you assume they know what they're doing that things go wrong. And he says, and Dan, I have drivers that have been here 15, 20, 30, 40 times. And he goes, they bring us coffees. They still go over that with 45 minutes. And he goes, and that's our quality control. So when it gets up there, there's no issues. And he says, and we started doing that because we had people coming in, the same drivers coming in. He said, and we'd let them strap it. And one day we found this guy on his phone, like he was on his phone and he's strapping, and then he goes, I didn't really think anything of it. He gets up to the Bruce Power Plant, and one strap went wrong, completely crushed the circuit board. The whole thing come back, rebuild it, and send it back up. And he says, and that was a $200,000 mistake of my part because the guy just was distracted. And he goes, and now everybody has earphones, so you don't even know if they're on the phone anymore. Like he goes, this is back in the day with the flip phones when you kind of had to hold it in your shoulder. He goes, nowadays I have no idea if somebody's on the phone or not because they bring it into, it's a drive-in bay, they load it, and then they got to go out to the parking lot to strap it. And another one comes in and they load and they strap it. So what they do is they have all these guys in the parking lot, summer and winter, going, okay, here. And he goes, and what they actually did is they built a secondary building where the drivers can pull into in the wintertime. Because he says it's not fair that they're loading that in the winter, which I think is pretty cool. But they everyone, no matter what, you have a half hour, 45-minute session of where you can strap it.
The extension of what I was talking about, I think this applies to everybody that's listening in about partnerships and building good relationships. The way, Jeff was talking about what happens when you get that damage and the cost. The way we recovered was that every dealer that we would deliver to has a paint shop. And the old saying was, it'll buff out. The dealer will be able to buff that out, right? Well, here's how. In our Rolodex, we had every dealer, we had every guy that worked in the paint shop, we had every forklift driver, we bought them tickets to all the football matches. We had a Rolodex of anniversaries and events across the entire country, people we looked after. And sometimes we looked after them for no reason, but you knew when that one skid steer came in and we chained it up the wrong way and we'd broken some hydraulic lines, it all came back to you. It's like paying it forward. Yes. We were incredibly good at paying it forward because we just knew mistakes were going to happen. And even though we factored it in, there was a cost. What was more important was the recovery, how quickly you recovered from it, because it was a phone call. Because we'd say on the way, hey, we've got some damage coming. Can you clean it up before the customer comes in to pick up their machine? And that worked. It worked 99 times out of 100. It was a really effective way. But the critical part was we invested in the relationships. So how did I find all these people? I delivered the loads initially.
There you go.
I was the general manager and I delivered the machines and I got to know people and they got to know me so that they knew when they could call me and say, hey, where is my combine harvester in the build slot schedule? I could tell them exactly where it is and I could tell them exactly what truck it's going to be on and exactly what day will be in their dealership. That is like, it's a level of customer service that you've got to go to, but physically meeting people, going out there, building relationships. Jeff, it takes an enormous amount of time to do this stuff, but wow.
I know. And I'll tell you that's why personally we can agree to disagree. That's why I like dedicated business with the same carrier, because the dock supervisor gets to know the driver gets to know the dock supervisor. They build those relationships. They bring pizza, they get coffee, they know how the operation works better than they do. They know where to bump docks constantly all the time, and it minimizes those risks and those additional added costs that you can avoid. When you go to those transactional businesses, you're having all different carriers going and bumping docks all over the freaking place. They don't understand that. So that's why I like to minimize my risk and have that pool of carriers and drivers that know my shippers. They know what they're getting into. They know how it's loaded, everything down packed.
Critical.
Those are kind of things that you have to think about, to what Dean was talking about. It's critical.
Cost to train.
Pays off.
There's a cost to train. And there's a cost to, this is one of the biggest reasons today that salespeople face, right? I don't have enough business to keep my present carriers moving. And not only that, they know my business. I bring you in, I'm adding one person to the mix, which means I'm pulling from Peter and Paul to pay you. Right. And you have no idea how this works.
Right.
Right. And I mean, maybe not on those words, but that's the underlining message that salespeople are getting today.
Yeah.
And it's true. It's like, sure, my customer can pull capacity from everywhere. But now he has to train them on his delivery times, where to go on delivery, where to sit, where to wait, what to do, how to do this, what to do if this goes wrong. Because over time, we've learned all this stuff. And it's, but the flip side of that, I honor that customers are not bringing in new carriers if they don't have the volume to maintain the business with them, never mind add a new one. Because if I was one of those carriers, I'd be like, you know what I mean? Like there's obviously an A and B and up and down, a left and right with every conversation. And I think that's honorable. And I tell them, I go, that's honorable. If I was one of your carriers, I'd love the fact that you're saying this to salespeople at call. What are you thinking about picking up? Like, what's your idea of things happening? Can we maybe talk about any new lanes you get? Can we, and that's where the conversation starts, where here's the new lane. This is what the parameters are. This is how you get in the door.
Right. That's how the seamless transition. Right. You have a carrier in there, you get another opportunity and a lane opportunity. You talk to your carrier like, hey, do you go to this area? And then you talk to the ship and you go, guess what? This carrier I'm bringing in is already an incumbent carrier. He knows the product. He knows how to handle it. He's willing to do your extra lane for X. Will it work? It's $150 more. But when you take into consideration everything that he knows, there's no training. You don't have to worry about risk or management or anything. Is that worth it? Is that worth spending the extra $150 per load?
So this is an interesting discussion, because this is how you sell value, not price.
That's it.
Because the one thing with, and I'll use the Case New Holland Farm Machinery contract, we were incredibly expensive. There's no question in the world that we had the best equipment, the best trucks, the best drivers, the best trailers. We had the best network service. We had just a flawless customer level of customer service. The reason we knew that, the reason we were regarded as that, and people said, yep, we'll pay for that, was because it wasn't about the machine and the load. It was about the weather and when the harvest was going to be at its peak yield per ton, peak tonnage per acre. And we knew that. We knew that from our weather predictions. So we'd have this big weather modeling system in our trucking business, and we would know that in this area, wheat was going to harvest this week in the year. And because if you miss the harvest, like if you miss your timing, that can cost the farmer hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. So that was how we did it, because we were the point-to-point logistics person, right down to making sure the farmer had his machine, the right machine with all of the attachments ready to go when they had that harvest. And we would go as far as flying to Racine, Wisconsin, and making sure we would look at the build sequence of all of the combine harvesters for next summer's harvest. But we were a year in advance. We were making sure that we knew exactly where they were. We were studying long-term weather patterns. And we're a trucking business with like 35 trucks and 130 trailers. And because, it wasn't a big business in terms of, it was a big trucking business in Australia, but it's all specialized. But it all came down to relationships and planning and making sure that you communicated with people regularly. And when the hard times fell, you knew who you could lean on. And they always came through because you were a trusted provider.
Yep.
Dean, it's interesting you say that, because every product I haul, I think of the end user. When I was hauling granite and all these other stones, I would think of the person that's getting their kitchen remodeled.
Right.
And, what are they going to say when somebody says, yeah, your granite was on the way, but it got broken, but it never showed up, right? So I'd always think of that end user. When I was in automotive, it was always that person going to buy the first brand new car, or that person that the lease is up and they want that new vehicle and they want it with every component, not missing a side panel. And I know some people say, Dan, that's silly because they'll just but that's the way I thought about it, was this is our job. Like we've all, and I think we've all been there, right? And I think, again, this comes down to perspective. We've all been there. If you've ever bought a new home, if you ever bought a new car, if you ever bought a new motorcycle, if you ever bought new fascia or stone for the side of your house, if you ever did any renovations, the drywall, the paint, it's like the smile on your face when whatever it is, whatever shiny that you bought or whatever renovation or whatever it is done. It's like, the feeling you get, that dopamine, that endorphin, that feeling you get, that's the feeling I believe I deliver with every single order. Because if I was not there, the end person would not get it. And I know it might seem, oh, come on, Dan, if you weren't there, but that's the way I think about it.
Yeah.
That's the way I think about my job. That's the way I think about my career, is if I didn't do what I did, I wouldn't be looking at you right now because I wouldn't have a camera. Right. And again, that perspective changes the way you look at the A, B, C, D, and E that got you there. Right. Like, how would you feel if your house is being built and because somebody didn't do their job, the brick was delayed for a week and they couldn't do anything? They could not move forward. Right. Normally they just go to the interior. But I'm saying if they could not move forward. Right. I had a buddy who just got his Lightning truck, the Ford F-150. And he said, they called him up and they said, your Ford's here. And he says, okay. They said, but there's a few issues. So you have options. He says, okay. There's no heated seats or no rear heated seats, no heated steering wheel. You're missing this function and that function. 4 pretty big functions. He says, well, why? We're short of chips.
Still.
And still. You got it 4 weeks ago. And he said, I'll take it. And they said, okay. And when he did that, I was like, why would you do that? I said, like, and again, heated steering wheel in Canada is like a must in winter time, dude. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, I get it. No heated rear seats. Okay. So when you have passengers, they don't have heated rear seats. Big deal. I mean, that's kind of like a bonus over the last 2 years anyway. But he bought a platinum truck, which is the top of the line F-150 Lightning. I was looking at a Lariat and they wanted like $2,200. So he's up around that $3,000 mark a month for lease. And I said, like, did they take any money off the lease? He goes, no, it's a platinum. I'm like, no, it's not.
They're right.
Because you're missing these 4 things. It's not a platinum. And so you see, for me, as the person that's trying to make transistor chips, that's the person I'm thinking of.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so it's as a salesperson, if you don't, I think we have to think like 3, 4, 5 lines down as to how would the end consumer feel about this stuff, right? If you go in and you freeze because you have your reefer set too cold or your reefer screws up and you freeze watermelons or something, they taste different. You know what I mean? Like, and so, anyways, I don't know where I was going with that.
Totally we got it. No, you're right. Yeah, no, I'm saying now you understand the reason why I feel for the shipper, because I feel that as a shipper. What I do, how is that going to relate to the shipper? I was there. I want to feel what that shipper is feeling, and if he's sad, I'm definitely sad because I wouldn't expect it myself if I was receiving that type of service. And that's what kind of gets me going, man, because I always think of that shipper. Always.
Good combo, boys. Diener, what's what are we going to be paying attention to over the next couple of weeks here, pal?
Because we're going to show every Tuesday. DatCon's coming up in October. I think it's 10 to 12. DatCon's going to be in Houston this year, so that's going to be our big annual event where a lot of our brokers will be in attendance. A lot of our shippers, a lot of our carriers will be there. That's probably the big event on our calendar that we're all working towards now.
I meant. Sorry, I apologize. I that was the last question. But what are we going to be focusing on for the next couple of weeks from a data perspective? Like, what should people be looking at? What are we going to be talking about? Kind of, what are we tracking right now? What are we trending on?
Yeah, I think the big data point I'm watching is how much spot rates fall off. Contract rates are still dropping. They dropped 15% in the last 2 weeks of June compared to the first 2 weeks of June. So contract rates are still coming in lower. They've been doing that all year. So contract rates are still heading south. There is definitely a bottoming of spot rates. If they stay around this level and bounce around, I wouldn't be surprised all the way through year end. But I think the determining number that I'm watching, Dan, is the number of carriers that are leaving the industry in the interstate sector. In May, we'd lost about 2,600. The net was 2,600. It was 2,400 in June. So we lost fewer carriers across the board. Doesn't move the national needle much. So we're still seeing carriers leave. I think what I'll be watching, one of the biggest numbers I'll be watching in terms of the change in capacity is the change in diesel prices, because as diesel prices drop, they increase the profit margin for carriers at the current rate level. So there's a couple of levers that are kind of we're watching right now is do spot rates stay where they are? And if they do and diesel keeps dropping, then carriers' profitability margins keep expanding.
But if not,
right,
they're going to lose their shirt.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the downside. Yep. Absolutely.
It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how we
Very
manage with that. Well, everybody, thank you for watching. As always, I don't know if y'all know, but LinkedIn last week had major live issues. So head on over to YouTube, to Sales Chatter over on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe there. I'm trying to kind of push everybody over to YouTube. For all of you watching, listening, tomorrow is Mindset Thursday. And then we got Jeff coming back on Friday. Dean, what are you doing Friday? Do you want to come answer any questions?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be on Mars somewhere.
Oh, you okay?
That's a good place to be.
I always said, somebody said, well, I'm thinking of having it next month. I go, yeah, I think I have COVID.
Yeah.
Pretty sure I won't be available. But anyways, so Dean's coming back on Friday with Jeff to do a little game show. Gonna be fun, y'all. Everybody have a fantastic day. Enjoy the weather while you can. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
See you guys.
Have a good day.